A gun on the table, a contract in her hand, and a Mafia king telling her, "You mean nothing to me." That's how Isabella Quinn's marriage began. Not with love, not even with hate, with a transaction. Roman De Luca thought he was buying silence, loyalty, obedience. Instead, he got a woman who refused to break, refused to flatter him, and refused to let him hide behind his grief. What started as a business arrangement quickly turned into something far more dangerous. A love story powerful enough to start a family war.
Feels. The gun was not pointed at Isabella Quinn, not exactly. It lay flat on the dark walnut table, heavy and quiet, beside a fountain pen and a contract thick enough to feel like a sentence. That made it worse. A gun in a hand was anger. Feels. A gun left in plain view was policy. It meant the man across from her did not need to threaten her twice. Roman DeLuca sat at the far end of the long dining table, in a private room above one of his legal businesses, Feels. A riverfront restaurant in Lower Manhattan that wealthy people loved because the lighting was flattering and the service made them feel important. Tonight the place was closed to the public. The staff had been sent home, Feels. The city glowed beyond the windows, soft and distant, as if this room existed outside the same moral weather as everything else. Feels. Isabella was 26 years old, tired to the bone, still wearing the blue sweater she had put on that morning before a landlord pounded on her mother's apartment door and reminded them, loudly, that grief did not excuse unpaid rent. Feels. She had taken the subway to get here because no one had offered her a car. Roman noticed that. He seemed to notice everything: her split cuticle, the scuffed heel of one boot, the fact that she had not touched the glass of water waiting at her place. Feels. He wore a charcoal suit without a wrinkle and no tie, as if the absence of one small thing was meant to suggest he was not trying too hard. It did not work. Everything about him suggested control so complete it had turned into a religion. "Read it, Feels," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that made silence rearrange itself around it. Isabella did not reach for the papers right away. "My father signed something," she said. "I want to know what he agreed to." Feels. Roman leaned back slightly in his chair. "Your father agreed to terms he did not fully understand. You will find that to be a pattern in his life." The words landed clean and cold. She hated that he was right. Feels. Michael Quinn had spent half his life promising salvation one card game away. He borrowed against tomorrow with the faith of a man who thought consequences were for other families. By the time his luck ran out for good, Feels, he had dragged everyone down with him. Her younger brother Marcus had tried, stupidly and sincerely, to fix one disaster with another. Feels. He borrowed money from men who called themselves investors and spoke with the smooth confidence of people used to collecting fear instead of interest. Marcus ended up in the emergency room with a cracked rib and a concussion. Feels. Michael disappeared before dawn 2 days later. No note, no apology, just absence. Feels. That was how Isabella found herself here, on the wrong side of polished wood, being studied by a man the city called a businessman in daylight and other names after dark. She opened the contract. The first page was precise, legal, clean. Debt transfer, Feels. Asset protection, non-disclosure. Term of marriage, 3 years minimum. Residence requirement, public appearances, mutual obligations. Financial relief for outstanding debts owed by Michael Quinn and Marcus Quinn, contingent upon her compliance. Feels. A line for her signature waited near the back like an open grave. She laughed once, a sound with no humor in it. "You're buying a wife." "No," Roman said. "I'm solving 3 problems with one arrangement. That's somehow worse." "Probably," Feels. He did not smile. Isabella flipped through the pages faster. "And if I say no?" Roman's expression did not change, but something in the air did. "Then your brother's debt remains active. Your mother loses the apartment within the month." Feels. "And the men who got hurt covering for your father decide they are no longer interested in being patient." He let the words settle. He had no need to decorate them. "I did not create your family's desperation, Miss Quinn. I am offering it structure." Feels. She stared at him, furious at the calm in his face, at her own pulse, at the humiliating fact that he had framed cruelty in the language of order. "You talk like a bank," she said. "Banks are less honest." Outside the windows, Feels. A ferry moved across black water like a line of weak gold. Isabella thought of her mother folding overdue notices into perfect squares because chaos looked smaller that way. She thought of Marcus trying not to wince when he hugged her. Feels. She thought of how many times women were told they had a choice, when all anyone had really done was make every other option unbearable. She reached the final page. Roman slid the pen toward her. There will be conditions, she said. For my mother, Eels. For Marcus, in writing, Eels. Rent paid directly, his debt cleared, medical bills covered. No one touches them, no one follows them. No one uses them to pressure me later. For the first time, Roman's attention sharpened into something like respect. Those terms are already included, Eels. And my work. Your employer will receive a generous explanation for your sudden resignation. I didn't say I was resigning. You will not be commuting from this arrangement to a nonprofit office in Brooklyn, Ms. Quinn. That is not realistic, Eels. Neither is any of this, he said, but we are here. She looked down again, and in the reflection on the lacquered table, she saw a woman she barely recognized. Not weak, not broken, cornered. There was a difference, Eels, and it mattered to her more than it mattered to him. She signed anyway. Her signature looked steady. She was proud of that, though she knew pride was a useless thing to cling to when your life had just been converted into clauses. Eels. Roman signed after her, his hand sure, elegant, almost detached. Then he capped the pen and closed the folder. A car will collect you tomorrow at 10, he said. Bring personal items only. Isabella laughed again, because anger needed somewhere to go. Eels. How thoughtful. Should I pack for grief or public relations? Roman stood. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who seemed carved for doorways and final decisions. Pack for survival, he said. Eels. It's the more practical wardrobe. She should have slapped him. She wanted to. Instead, she stood too, forcing herself to hold his gaze. Up close, his eyes were not simply gray. They were layered. Storm and ash and something tired underneath. Eels. You think this makes you powerful, she said. No, Roman replied. Power is what allowed me to avoid this for as long as I did. That confused her enough to silence her. He moved past her then, Eels, and the scent of cedar and cold air followed him toward the door. Eels. A man in his 50s with silver at his temples appeared outside, discreet as a shadow with good posture. He nodded once to Isabella. Vincent will see you home, Roman said without turning back. Welcome to a life neither of us wanted. Eels. The next morning, her mother cried quietly on the sidewalk because loud grief embarrassed her. Marcus tried to carry Isabella's suitcase with one arm and failed. The car waiting at the curb looked expensive in the restrained way that said old money. Eels. New danger, Vincent drove. He did not ask unnecessary questions. Eels. New York passed around them in layers Isabella knew well, and then layers she had only ever entered for work events where rich donors said things like impact and access over wine that cost too much. Queens became Midtown glass. Eels. Sidewalk laundromats gave way to silent lobbies and men with earpieces. Eels. When the elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse, she understood that wealth could be just as isolating as poverty, only with better flooring. Eels. The apartment was all stone and windows and precise furniture chosen by someone who valued clean lines over comfort. It did not feel lived in. It felt managed. Elena, the house manager, Eels, took her coat and led her to the east wing as if introducing a guest to a hotel suite. Closet full, bathroom stocked, bedroom larger than the apartment where Isabella grew up. Mr. DeLuca eats at 7, Elena said. Formal dinner. Eels. Does he prefer joy? Isabella asked. Elena's mouth almost twitched. Mr. DeLuca prefers efficiency. Alone, Isabella stood in the center of the room and listened. Nothing. No television from another apartment. Eels. No sirens close enough to feel familiar. No pipes. No neighbor arguing in Spanish through thin walls. Silence in a place like this was not peace. It was insulation. Eels. That night, Roman came home at 6:30 and the air altered before she even saw him. The elevator hummed. Low voices. The apartment itself seemed to straighten. Eels. Isabella wore a black dress Elena had selected because everything in the closet looked expensive enough to apologize for. Roman walked in with his jacket over one arm and paused when he saw her. Eels. As if he had honestly forgotten there was now another person living inside his arrangement. Isabella, he said. Mr. DeLuca. He set the jacket down. Roman. We are married in 48 hours. We can at least be efficient with the fiction. Eels. Dinner was beautiful and tasted like nothing because fear edits appetite. He asked if she had settled in. She asked why he chose her. He gave her a version of the truth dressed as strategy. Young, educated, presentable, no scandal. Eels. Capable of helping him smooth the public edges of enterprises that preferred not to be examined too closely. Eels. So I'm a respectable face for questionable money, she said. You are a stabilizing factor, he corrected. That sounds better in your head than it does out loud. Most things do. There were moments, tiny and annoying, Heels, when she almost saw humor in him. Not softness, just an awareness of absurdity he refused to indulge. She hated those moments because they complicated him. Monsters were easier when they stayed one shape. Heels. The wedding itself happened in a chapel on the Upper East Side that smelled faintly of lilies and expensive polish. 200 people attended, men in dark suits, women with diamonds like declarations, public officials, investors, Heels, charitable board members. Men Isabella knew on sight were dangerous because they were too relaxed around people who mattered. Her mother came in a pale blue dress and looked smaller than usual. Marcus had his sling off and smiled too hard. Heels. Roman stood at the altar like a man agreeing to a merger. Heels. The officiant spoke about partnership and devotion, words so misaligned with reality that Isabella nearly laughed again. Roman's hand was warm when he took hers. She noticed that against her will. Cameras flashed. Heels. The vow left her mouth in a voice she barely recognized. When he kissed her, it was brief and cool and perfectly measured. Performance. The reception moved to the penthouse. Champagne, light jazz, Heels. Conversations where people congratulated her, while trying to calculate what Roman DeLuca gained from marrying a woman from nowhere. Margaret Hastings, who chaired a cancer foundation and wore cruelty like good tailoring, Heels, air-kissed near Roman's cheek and looked Isabella over with genteel hostility. How unexpected, she said. I assumed Roman had given up on domestic optimism. Isabella smiled. That must make me a public service. Heels. Margaret's eyes flashed approval or surprise. Hard to tell with women like that. Heels. Roman's hand rested at the base of Isabella's spine all evening, not tender but steady, as if reminding the room she was under his protection and his authority in equal measure. By midnight, her cheeks hurt from smiling. Her feet were on fire. Heels. The last guest finally left. Catering disappeared. Elena vanished with the efficiency of a stage manager after the final cue. The apartment fell quiet around the wreckage of flowers and crystal. Roman loosened his tie. Isabella slipped off her heels. Heels. You did well, he said. So did you. He poured whiskey. She expected him to go to his own rooms. Instead, he crossed the room and stopped in front of her. Too close. Close enough that she saw the fine fatigue at the corners of his eyes. Heels. Take off the dress, he said. The room went still inside her. What? The dress. His face gave her nothing. You mean nothing to me, Isabella. Don't make the mistake of believing this is anything but business. Heels. The words hit harder than if he had raised his voice. She stared at him, waiting for the correction that never came. Humiliation burned hot and bright. You're cruel, she said, usually for a reason. Then congratulations, she snapped. Heels. You're efficient. She walked away before he could see the tears gather. In the East Wing bedroom, still half-laced into silk she could not afford and never wanted, Isabella cried into a pillow large enough to feel ridiculous. Heels. But even through the grief and rage, one thought stayed sharp. He wanted distance. Fine, distance could be survived. She had survived worse things than rich men with grief masquerading as discipline. In the first week, Heels. Roman left early and returned late. They ate together because appearances mattered to Elena, and because routine, Isabella learned, was one of the quiet weapons wealthy people used to make control look civilized. Heels. He asked if her mother had received the lease renewal. She had. Heels. 3 years paid directly, just as promised. Marcus's debt disappeared from the people who had been calling. That mattered. It mattered more than her pride. Still, the apartment felt less like a home than a beautifully staged hostage note. She wandered. Heels. She read. She called her mother and lied gently. She texted Marcus and told him recovery needed patience, not guilt. She found the library by accident on the 8th day, hidden behind a paneled door in the south wing. Heels. It was the first room in the penthouse with warmth in it. Books climbed to the ceiling. Leather softened the corners. A reading lamp cast honest light. Roman found her there late one afternoon, curled in a chair with a novel open in her lap. Heels. He stopped in the doorway. I didn't know you had found this room, he said. I didn't know you had one, she replied. It's your home, too. That sentence still sounds fictional. He should have left. Heels. Instead, he came in and stood at the window, looking out over the city like a man searching for something it had once promised him. He looked tired, more than tired, strained in places he normally kept locked down. Rough day, she asked. You could say that, Heels. Want to talk about it? No. He stayed anyway. That was the first crack. Small, easy to miss. But Isabella noticed because she had spent her whole life reading moods before they became damage. She learned other things over the following weeks. Heels. White roses appeared in her room every few days with no note attached. Roman noticed if she skipped breakfast or went too long without sleep. Heels. He had a scar across 2 knuckles on his left hand and rubbed his wedding ring with his thumb when he was under pressure, as if even he was surprised by the symbol. Heels. One night, after a brutal phone call with her mother that left Isabella fighting tears at the dinner table, he asked what happened in a tone so direct it sounded almost offended by her distress. She told him about the rent panic, Heels, the distrust that clung to people who had gone too long without safety. He listened. Then he said, Vincent will send written confirmation. It is easier for some people to believe paper. You don't have to do that. I know. Then why? Heels. Roman cut into his food with surgical care. Because your family's stability is part of the arrangement. Business language. But there was something gentler under it, something that made her look up. He did not meet her eyes. Heels. That night she lay awake thinking about the difference between kindness and responsibility, and whether wounded men sometimes hid the first inside the second because they feared the cost of naming it. 3 weeks into the marriage, Heels. Roman came home with blood on his shirt and a cut above his brow. Heels. Isabella was in the living room reading. Because sleep had become a negotiation she rarely won, before 2 a.m. she stood so fast her wineglass tipped over. What happened? Roman barely glanced at her. Nothing. That is clearly blood. Not all of it is mine. Heels. He moved past her toward the hallway. She reached for his wrist before she could think better of it. He stopped dead. His hand closed around her wrist. Not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to make boundaries physical. Don't, he said. Heels. You need a doctor. I need you to go to bed. No. The word surprised both of them. Roman turned slowly. Something dangerous flickered across his face, not because she had challenged him, Heels, but because he seemed unsure whether to be angry or impressed that she had. You don't understand the world you are in, he said. Then explain it. She shot back. No. Why? His jaw shifted. Because some knowledge is not protection, it is collateral. Heels. He let go of her and disappeared into his own wing. The next morning he was gone before she woke, but a note sat beside the fruit bowl in his sharp, slanted handwriting. Your mother's lease has been renewed in full for 3 years. Heels. The legal confirmation is in the drawer. R. She stared at the note for a long time. Men who meant nothing did not leave explanations. Men who felt nothing did not remember drawers. Later that day, frustrated by his evasions and her own growing curiosity, Heels, Isabella found his study. Locked. That annoyed her. She grew up in a building where locks only kept out polite people. It took her less than 2 minutes to open the door with an old habit and a thin metal hairpin. Heels. The room was darker than the rest of the apartment. All wood and deep shelves, and the sort of order that told you the occupant trusted very little to chance. Files, ledgers, shipping schedules, contracts, legitimate business on the surface. Heels. Other currents beneath it. She should have left then. Heels. Instead, she opened a lower drawer and found a photograph tucked under a leather folder. A woman stood in sunlight laughing at something beyond the frame. Dark hair loose, hand against Roman's chest, as if touching him had once been easy. On the back, Heels. In fading ink were 3 words. Forever Roman. There were letters too, bundled carefully. Caroline. The handwriting was elegant, open, alive. Isabella read one then another. Love, hope, frustration. The ordinary, intimate weather of a real marriage. Heels. The last letter was different, shorter, uneven. A goodbye written by someone trying to be brave for another person's sake. Isabella's throat tightened before she even reached the final lines. Cancer, stage 4. Heels. No strength left for the version of dying that requires witnesses. Caroline had chosen pills and silence rather than a hospital and erosion. She had told Roman not to blame himself. Heels. The sentence people write when they know blame is exactly what the living will choose. Heels. Isabella put the letters back with shaking hands and stood in the study, feeling something in the story tilt. Roman had not been born cold. He had been scorched there. It did not excuse him. It did explain the architecture. Heels. That night he came home at a reasonable hour and found her making tea in the kitchen. He hesitated in the doorway. You're still awake. So are you. Occupational hazard. She poured hot water into a second cup and held it up. Heels. Do mafia bosses drink chamomile? A shadow of something almost human crossed his face, only under duress. They sat at the kitchen island in silence that felt different now, less hostile, more aware. Isabella watched steam rise. Then she said, Heels. Thank you, for my mother. Roman's hand tightened around the mug. You already thanked me. No, I cried for 20 minutes and then insulted your tea preferences in my head. This is the formal version. He looked at her then, really looked, heels, and a tiny fracture opened in the wall between them. Heels. You're welcome, he said. She wanted to say, I know about Caroline. She did not. Instead, she said, you don't have to act like kindness is an accounting method with me. Roman went still. You think that's what I'm doing? I think you'd prefer it to be. Heels. For a moment, she thought he might send her away again. Instead, he gave one slow nod, as if conceding a point he had no energy to debate. That was the first evening the silence between them did not feel like punishment. Heels. It felt like two exhausted people taking a break from pretending. Heels. The shift was gradual enough that Isabella mistrusted it at first. That made it more believable. Real closeness rarely arrives like a movie scene. It accumulates. A second cup poured without asking. A text from Roman when the driver was running late. Heels. The discovery that he took his coffee black and hated eggs. Not because of preference, but because his childhood cook had burned them every Sunday, and he had never forgiven the smell. Heels. He read the financial pages every morning like a soldier scanning a perimeter. He was left-handed. He never sat with his back to open space. When stressed, he went very still instead of loud. That was something Isabella understood well. Heels. People with power raised their voices because they could. People shaped by danger often did the opposite. They saved energy for the moment that mattered. 4 weeks into the marriage, breakfast became routine. Heels. At 7 sharp, they met at the kitchen island or not at all. Sometimes they spoke for 5 minutes, sometimes not. Heels. But the presence itself became a kind of language. Isabella learned not to push every silence. Roman learned that not every question was a trap. He still disappeared into business meetings and late-night calls. Heels. She still had no illusion about the clean legal edges of his empire. But the human outline beneath the title became harder to ignore. One Friday morning, he mentioned a charity gala at a midtown museum and told her she needed to attend. Heels. Why do all rich people want to stand under bad lighting and pretend they enjoy each other? She asked. Roman glanced at her over his tablet. Because philanthropy is often guilt in formal wear. You say the sweetest things. That's why people donate. Heels. At the gala, Isabella wore emerald silk Elena, chose because apparently subtlety had been rejected as a concept. Heels. The room glimmered with old money, new tech wealth, politicians, art donors, real estate families, and the species of elegant predator who could discuss cancer research while calculating everyone's vulnerabilities by dessert. Roman stayed near her. Heels. Not glued to her side, that would have looked insecure, but near enough that anyone with eyes understood where they stood. Senator Halpern, who smiled like a man used to explaining away disappointing ethics, asked how they met. Heels. Isabella used the line Roman had given her, through family, unexpectedly. The senator laughed. The best arrangements usually are. Roman's hand settled at her lower back. I'm a fortunate man, he said, and the words were for the room. Heels. But the pressure of his palm was for her. Margaret Hastings appeared later in a cloud of diamonds and old social rank. Roman, she purred, then turned her bright cruelty on Isabella. Your wife is lovely, though I confess I'm surprised. Heels. After Caroline, I thought Roman's body changed before his face did. Isabella felt it. Every muscle in his back tightened under her fingertips. Margaret, he said softly, choose a different sentence. Margaret lifted a brow. I meant no harm. Heels. That has never once prevented you from causing it. He guided Isabella away with polite force. Near the bar, he ordered whiskey, drank half in one swallow, and stared into the room as if it had personally insulted him. Heels. You don't have to follow me when I walk away, he said after a moment. You don't have to leave me standing beside people who think women are decorative evidence, she replied. That surprised a huff of laughter out of him, brief and rough. Fair. Heels. When he stepped out onto the museum balcony for air, she followed anyway. Not because she wanted drama, because she had seen the look in his face when Margaret said Caroline's name. It was not only pain, it was old guilt opening like a bruise. Heels. The city spread below them in glitter and traffic, an endless human struggle. Roman braced both hands on the railing. You didn't have to come out here, he said. I know. Then why are you here? Isabella crossed to stand beside him, not touching. Heels. Because I'm tired of being treated like I can't handle honesty. He said nothing. She took a breath that felt reckless. I found the letters. Roman froze. Not physically. Something subtler. The kind of stillness that says impact has already happened. Heels. You broke into my study. Yes. You read private letters. Yes. And now? His voice had gone flat in a way that should have warned her off. Instead, it made her gentler. Heels. And now I think the cruelest thing you do is pretend grief made you less human instead of more afraid. He turned then, slowly. The city lights caught the exhaustion in his face. You think you understand me? No, Isabella said. Feels. I think I understand enough to know Caroline did not leave because she stopped loving you. His jaw tightened. Don't? Why? Because if we say her name honestly, you might have to stop using her death as proof that attachment is weakness. Feels. Roman's eyes darkened, not with anger exactly, but with the strain of containment. She killed herself, he said. The words tore out of him harder than he intended. Isabella's breath caught. Roman looked back over the railing, no longer at her. Feels. Stage 4. The doctor gave her a timeline. She told me she could live with treatment, maybe longer, but not in a way she would recognize. I thought we had more time. I thought love was going to count for something. Feels. I came home late one night because I was building a future she was already too tired to imagine. She left me a letter and a body and years of people telling me it wasn't my fault, as if repetition could make that true. He laughed once, Feels, bitter and stunned by his own honesty. Feels. Do you know what it does to a man? Finding someone he loves because he was too busy controlling every solvable thing to notice the one thing he couldn't solve? Isabella's eyes burned. It destroys him. Yes, Feels. But it doesn't make him responsible for her pain. You don't know that. I know that sickness can make people believe love is a burden instead of a shelter. I know shame lies. I know people make impossible decisions in impossible bodies. Feels. Roman looked at her then, and the nakedness in his face nearly broke her. No image, no title. Just a man who had spent years building steel around one wound and was suddenly too tired to hold the plates together. After Caroline, he said, I made rules. Feels. No dependence, no illusions, no one close enough to use against me. Then your father's debt crossed my desk. You were educated, capable. Your life intersected with mine in a way I could control. I told myself it was practical. Feels. I told myself it was cleaner than wanting. Feels. Isabella heard the truth under that. He had chosen a contract because contracts did not die from cancer. Contracts did not ask him to hope. And now? She asked quietly. The phone in his pocket buzzed before he answered. Feels. He looked at the screen and the vulnerability vanished so fast it made her ache. He became Roman DeLuca again, sharp-edged and contained. We need to leave, he said. Now. In the car, he made 2 calls in clipped Italian, then one in English. Warehouse. Feels. Message sent. No casualties. For now. Isabella watched his profile and felt a new species of fear take shape. This world was no longer abstract. What happened, she asked. Roman rubbed his hand over his mouth. Feels. Someone tried to hit one of my warehouses in Newark. They failed. It wasn't about product. It was about signaling access. Access to what? His gaze met hers. To vulnerability. The word sat between them like a live wire. You mean me. Feels. I mean, this marriage changed how my enemies think. Feels. You told me this was all optics. Optics become leverage if repeated often enough. Back at the penthouse, Roman checked the perimeter himself. Feels. Moving through rooms with the alert precision of someone who trusted systems only after confirming them with his own eyes. He spoke to security at the entrance. He called Vincent. He posted 2 extra men downstairs. Feels. Isabella watched him pace and understood something difficult and important. Control was not his vanity, it was his anesthesia. He finally stopped in front of her, jaw tight. Until this is handled, you don't leave without Vincent. No walks. Feels. No coffee runs. No errands. If anyone approaches you anywhere, you tell me immediately. I've barely left the building in 2 months. I am aware. Then what changes? His face broke open for a second. Feels. The fact that if I lose you because I miscalculated, I will not survive it a second time. The sentence hung there, honest enough to make the room tilt. Feels. Isabella did the stupidest thing she had done since signing the contract. She stepped into him and wrapped her arms around his ribs. He went rigid, for one breath. Then his arms came around her like a reflex he no longer had the strength to deny. Feels. He held on hard, not romantic, not polished, human. She felt his heartbeat against her temple, fast and uneven. I'm here, she murmured, not because she believed reassurance could solve this. Feels. But because human beings deserve to hear they are not alone even when solutions fail. He exhaled against her hair. That is the problem. The next morning he was gone before she woke. A note waited on the kitchen counter. Stay inside. Back tonight. R. Feels. Isabella crumpled it, then smoothed it flat again because anger did not change ink. Elena found her pacing before noon. He's impossible, Isabella said. Feels. Elena poured coffee with the expression of a woman who had professionally managed impossible for years. Yes. That's all you have to say? No. feels, but it is the safest place to start. Isabella studied her. You knew Caroline. Elena went still for the first time since Isabella met her. I did. What was she like? Elena looked down into her cup. Kind, brave in quiet ways. Feels. She loved him without being impressed by him, which is rarer than you might think. Did she make him better? That is a dangerous question. Why? Elena lifted her eyes. Because women are told too often that their worth lies in redeeming damaged men. Feels. It is not your job to save him, Mrs. DeLuca. It is only your job not to disappear while he decides whether to save himself. The words landed with the force of truth. Isabella sat down slowly. Do you think he can? Feels. I think grief taught him to confuse possession with protection, Elena said. And fear taught him that distance is mercy. Both are lies, but old lies become habits. That line stayed with Isabella all day. Old lies become habits. Feels. It explained Roman better than any file could. Feels. When he came home that night with blood on his cuff and exhaustion in his posture, she met him in the library doorway. You're hurt. It's not mine. That answer remains deeply unhelpful. To her surprise, he almost smiled. I am trying. Poorly. Feels. He loosened his collar and stood by the window in the blue dark. The city reflected in the glass around him, like 1,000 small fires he could not quite control. Isabella crossed the room, and without asking permission, Feels, straightened his collar with careful fingers. He went still again. His skin was warm under the edge of the fabric. Thank you, she said quietly, for protecting me. It's my responsibility. Is that all it is? Feels. Roman's hand came up and covered hers where it rested against his chest. His thumb moved once across her knuckles, gentle enough to feel dangerous. You should sleep, he said. It was not an answer. It was, however, Feels, the first time he held her hand without necessity as an alibi. That mattered. Feels. So did the fact that he looked at her as if she had become both refuge and risk. Isabella went to bed frightened by one clear realization. She was falling for him. Not the myth, not the money. The man beneath all that weaponized composure. Feels. The widower who still blamed himself. The son who read threat reports over coffee. The husband who said cruel things when tenderness frightened him more than violence ever could. Loving him would not be safe. Loving him would not be wise. Feels. But wisdom had never once paid rent on time or stopped the heart from choosing. In the days that followed, Isabella stopped pretending she was merely an ornament in a well-funded arrangement. She paid attention. Feels. She asked Elena how the household functioned and who answered to whom. She noticed which names in Roman's calls came with irritation and which came with caution. At public events, she watched the room watching him. Feels. Real estate magnates shook his hand too eagerly. Judges avoided certain topics. Feels. Younger men with inherited confidence resented him because he had built something instead of simply receiving it. She learned that his empire was less theatrical than gossip imagined, and therefore more dangerous. Shipping, warehousing, construction, deals, nightclubs, real estate holding companies, private equity relationships threaded through shell structures, most of it legal enough to survive daylight, enough of it not legal enough to require private loyalty purchased through fear, debt, or gratitude. Feels. Who is pressing you? She asked over breakfast one morning after another call made his mouth harden. Roman looked up. I didn't say anyone was. You don't have to. Your jaw does a full press release. To her surprise, he laughed. Short, real, Feels. It changed his face in a way that made her chest tighten. Do not get used to it, he said. Too late, he set down his coffee. There are a few possibilities. Rivals who think I've become distracted. People loyal to older methods. Feels. Men who mistake patience for softness. Older methods? Roman's gaze shifted, just for a moment. My father taught many people that fear is the purest form of leadership, and you disagree. I think fear is efficient, Roman said carefully. Feels. I also think it corrodes whatever it touches. That sounds like disagreement. That sounds like experience. He did not say more, but the name settled between them without being spoken. His father, the man behind the shape of his first education. Feels. Isabella understood then that the greatest threat might not come from outside Roman's world, but from the part of it he had inherited. Feels. They crossed another threshold the afternoon Isabella went into the study a second time and was caught with Caroline's final letter in her hand. She had told herself she was looking for context, not trespassing. That was a lie, and both of them knew it. Feels. Roman stood in the doorway, motionless, taking in the open drawer, the ribbon of old letters, the tears she had not had time to wipe away. Find what you were looking for? He asked. His tone was neutral in the way controlled anger often is. Feels. Isabella inhaled shakily. Not what I expected. He crossed the room, took the letter from her, and set it back in the drawer with more care than he gave most living people. You should not be here, I know. Then why are you? Feels. Because I'm tired of competing with a dead woman I don't even resent. That stopped him. He turned. What? Isabella wiped at her face, annoyed by how young grief could make a person feel. I don't hate Caroline. Feels. I hate that you keep turning her into a wall when she was clearly once a bridge. Roman stared at her, then laughed once without humor. You say impossible things with remarkable confidence. Maybe because impossible things are already happening. Feels. I married a man I didn't know. I live in a museum with armed security. I'm in love with someone who thinks caring is an operational liability. My standards for reality are flexible now. Feels. The last line slipped out before she could decide if she meant to say it. The room changed, not because she had admitted love, because Roman heard the truth in her voice and could not dismiss it as strategy. He came closer, slowly, Feels, as if approaching an edge. You should not say that unless you understand what it costs, he said. Then tell me. His throat worked once. It costs sleep. It costs judgment. It gives enemies leverage and guilt a fresh address. Feels. It makes you imagine futures you cannot guarantee. Feels. It makes you cruel in advance because you are terrified of being helpless later. Isabella held his gaze. That doesn't sound like love. That sounds like trauma holding the pen. Something in him broke then. Not dramatically, not with tears, with honesty. Feels. I'm starting to care about you in ways I was not supposed to, he said. And it scares the hell out of me because I do not know how to do that without eventually turning everything around me into damage. She stepped closer too. Feels. Then maybe we stop treating damage like destiny. Roman's hand came up to her face with a hesitation that hurt more than decisiveness would have. He brushed his thumb under one eye, catching a tear. You make everything harder. Good. Feels. You should not be proud of that. I'm a little proud. He huffed something close to a laugh, then kissed her. Not the wedding performance. Not cautious. A real kiss, hungry with restraint finally giving way. Feels. Grief and fear and relief colliding all at once. Feels. Isabella kissed him back with both hands in his shirt, because if she did not hold on, she might float right out of herself. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Roman rested his forehead against hers. This is a terrible idea, he murmured. Feels. You keep saying that, because it remains true. A lot of true things are worth doing anyway. He looked at her as if the sentence itself threatened him. Then he kissed her again, softer, longer, Feels. Like a man testing whether gentleness could be survived. Everything changed after that, though not in the neat way stories often promise. Roman did not suddenly become easy. Isabella did not become less wary of the world he inhabited, Feels. But the silence between them warmed. He started seeking her out when he came home late instead of disappearing to his own wing. He would find her in the library or kitchen and sit nearby, too tired for words but no longer willing to be alone in the dark. Feels. They talked sometimes about childhood, about books. Feels. About how guilt can turn into identity if you let it. Roman told her fragments of his life in the early hours when honesty cost less because there were fewer witnesses. His father, Vincent DeLuca, Feels, had built the first version of the organization from dockside extortion, unions, trucking contracts, and the old immigrant neighborhoods where the law showed up mostly to collect humiliation. Roman's mother died when he was 12. Aneurysm, sudden, Feels. After that, affection became a luxury no one in the house knew how to provide. Vincent Sr. taught his son the lessons men call practical when they do not want to admit they are brutal. Never let anyone know what matters to you, Feels. People are loyal to outcomes, not ideals. Fear is cleaner than gratitude because it requires less maintenance. Roman learned all of it. He also learned to hate the smallness that came with worshiping control, Feels. Caroline had been the first person to challenge those rules without treating him like a problem to be solved, Feels. She worked in nonprofit fundraising, loved museums and bad old films, and had the unnerving habit of asking simple moral questions in rooms where everyone else preferred euphemism, Feels. She told him once that power without tenderness becomes self-cannibalizing. He had loved her for talking to him like a man instead of a machine. He had also, Isabella suspected, Feels, never entirely forgiven himself for building a life where she thought her illness would become one more burden he had to manage. She wanted to protect me, he said one night in bed, Feels. The room dark except for city light pressing dimly through the curtains. They had not slept together in the technical sense, not at first. The intimacy between them grew through conversation, through holding each other in exhausted silence, heals, through the radical experience of being witnessed without performance. And I resented that, even while I understood it. I thought if I controlled enough variables, I could make room for love without risk, heals. That was arrogant. Isabella lay on her side facing him, his hand resting warm at her waist. No, she said. It was human. Human is just messier than men like your father allow. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slightly, heals, as if receiving mercy still felt unfamiliar. The next morning, he had to leave before sunrise. He wrote had to go. Stay as long as you like on the pillow beside her. It was such a simple sentence, but its gentleness undid her, heals. Elena found Isabella in the kitchen wearing one of Roman's white shirts and smiled in a way that was almost maternal. Don't, Isabella warned. I am not saying a word. Your face is. That is beyond my authority, heals. Their fragile calm ended the evening. Roman came home with a face that had gone pale under his tan. We need to talk, he said. Isabella's stomach dropped. Roman poured whiskey, then didn't drink it. That was how she knew it was serious. Heals. My father wants to meet you. Your father, she repeated. Roman nodded once. Heals. He no longer runs day-to-day operations. Officially, he retired years ago. Unofficially, he considers retirement a vocabulary issue. He lives upstate, keeps a circle of old loyalists, and interferes when he thinks I'm forgetting what the family is. Heals. Isabella tried for steady. Okay, so I meet him. Roman's mouth flattened. You are not hearing the part that matters. If he decides you make me look weak, he will try to remove the problem. Remove as in remove. The bluntness chilled the room. Heals. Isabella sat down slowly. And you're telling me this like there isn't a better plan? Roman came toward her and crouched, so they were eye level. He did that when he needed her attention in its purest form. Listen to me. Tomorrow night, Heals, he comes here for dinner. He will test you. He will ask questions that sound harmless and mean none of it. He will insult you politely. He will look for fear, because fear tells him where the leverage is. I need you to be composed. You want me to perform. Heals. I want you to survive. She stared at him, at the genuine fear he was trying to manage into strategy. Did he hate Caroline? Roman looked away for the first time. He thought she made me sentimental. That's not what I asked. Heals. His face hardened with old pain. He thinks love is a defect. Isabella was quiet a long moment. Then she put her hand over his, then maybe the defect is him. Roman's smile was brief and sad. You will not say that at dinner. No promises. Isabella. Heals. Fine, limited promises. The next day turned the apartment into a subtle battlefield. Elena chose a black dress with clean lines and no excess softness. You need to look like you belong here, she said. What if he asks where I'm from? Heals. Say Queens without apologizing for it. What if he insults my family? Elena's gaze sharpened. Then remember that shame is often a gift handed to women in rooms built by men who should be ashamed of themselves. You do not have to accept the package. Heals. By 6, Isabella had memorized the posture of calm, even though her heart kept trying to punch through her ribs. Vincent Sr. arrived exactly on time. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired, elegant, heels, and colder than Roman in the way only an older cruelty can be. Roman's eyes came from him. So did the unsettling stillness. But where Roman's restraint sometimes made room for thought, his father's restraint felt like contempt with polished manners. Heels. He looked at Isabella the way some people inspect a racehorse they did not intend to buy. So, he said, you're the girl. Isabella stepped forward and offered her hand. Isabella, it's nice to meet you. He did not take her hand immediately. Then he did, Heels. Briefly, grip precise and dry. Is it? Roman her a warning glance. Vincent Sr. smiled, thin and fascinated. She has a mouth. She also has excellent judgment, Roman said. Which makes one of us? Heels. Dinner was torture arranged on porcelain. Heels. Vincent Sr. asked about Isabella's education, her family, her work, her routines, her understanding of what Roman had built. Every question contained 2 blades, one for information, one for humiliation. Isabella answered with care. Heels. Her father had worked in finance, which was true if you were generous enough to count bad gambling math as a profession. Her mother taught 2nd grade, which was true until layoffs and illness turned teaching into substitute gigs. Heels. She had worked in community outreach and housing advocacy, which she refused to diminish simply because men like Vincent DeLuca only respected money that could be counted in towers. Housing advocacy, he said, slicing into his steak. How noble, Heels. Housing keeps people alive, Isabella said. That seems practical to me. Vincent Sr. glanced at Roman. Roman's voice stayed even. I choose mine. The old man ignored that. Tell me, Isabella. Eels. What do you think of my son's work trap? Eels. The word itself might as well have been carved into the table. Isabella set down her fork. I think he built something enduring. Built on what? Discipline, intelligence, hard choices. Vincent Sr.'s smile sharpened. Eels. And you approve of those hard choices? Isabella met his eyes. I approve of the fact that people under his protection appear to stay protected. Roman went very still beside her. She felt it like a current. Vincent Sr. leaned back. Protection, Eels, he repeated. That is such a tender word for coercion. Tenderness and coercion are not the same, Isabella said before she could stop herself. The table fell silent. Roman's hand closed hard around his water glass. Elena, from the sideboard, Eels, froze mid-pour. Vincent Sr. laughed. One clean note. There it is. Fire. He dabbed his mouth with his napkin. Caroline used to say similar things before she learned the world rarely rewards moral distinctions. Eels. Roman's fork hit the plate with a sound too loud for good manners. Do not use her name to make a point, he said. His father turned to him lazily. Why not? She is dead. If the dead cannot teach the living, what exactly are they for? Eels. Isabella felt fury rise so fast it tasted metallic. Roman's hand shook once on the tablecloth, then stilled. She put her fingers lightly over his wrist, not to quiet him, but to tell him he was not alone in the room with that sentence. Vincent Sr. saw it. Eels. Of course he did. His eyes cooled further. Ah, he said softly. There it is. The weakness. Roman stood. Dinner is over. His father did not move. We are not finished. We are. Sit down, boy. Eels. Roman's face changed into something Isabella had not yet seen in full. Not the grief-struck man. Not the controlled businessman. The son forged by an older violence and finally tired of kneeling before it. You do not call me boy in my home. Eels. Your home? Vincent Sr. pushed back his chair with slow amusement. Everything here exists because I taught you what the world is. No, Roman said. Everything here exists because I learned what you are and chose not to become all of it. Eels. That landed. For the first time, the old man's expression cracked, not with hurt, with insult. He rose. Study, he said. Now, Roman looked at Isabella. The apology in his eyes was immediate and infuriatingly tender. Eels. Then he followed his father down the hall. Elena moved in silence, clearing plates that no one had really eaten. Isabella stood and paced once, twice, then stopped. Raised voices bled faintly from behind the study door. She could not make out every word, Eels, but enough came through. Compromised. Sentimental. Optics weak. Then Roman's voice, lower and more dangerous than she had ever heard it. Take the accounts if you want a war, but you do not get to decide who I care about. Eels. Isabella's breath caught. Eels. The study door opened minutes later. Vincent Sr. emerged first, his face carved back into elegance. He saw Isabella in the hallway and paused. Enjoy the illusion while it lasts, he said quietly. Men like my son always remember what love costs. Eels. Usually by making the woman pay first. He left before she could answer. Roman came out moments later looking as if he had aged 5 years and shed the ability to lie about being fine. Isabella crossed the hall and held him before he asked. Eels. He folded around her for 1 second, just enough for her to feel the tremor in his breath. I'm sorry, he said into her hair. For him? No. She pulled back and looked up at him. You're not responsible for the beliefs that raised you, Eels. Only for the ones you keep. Roman stared at her like the sentence hurt in a way he wanted. You should not know how to say things like that. Housing advocacy, she said. I contain multitudes. He laughed once, broken and grateful. Eels. 3 days later, he came home in the middle of the afternoon, gray with fury and lack of sleep. He's moving, Roman said without preamble. Isabella closed the book in her lap. Your father. He's speaking to the older families. Eels. Telling them I'm compromised. That marrying you proved I'm no longer fit to lead, Isabella slowly. Can he do that? Roman dragged a hand through his hair. If enough people decide fear is preferable to reform, yes. He still has loyalists. Eels. Men who think legal fronts and institutional relationships made us soft. Men who miss the simplicity of blood as policy. And what do they think I am? Roman's smile was all knives and no humor. Evidence. The word chilled her more than threat itself. Eels. Evidence. As if her existence beside him was a legal exhibit in a case against his authority. What happens now? She asked. Roman stopped pacing. The room turned quiet enough to hear traffic far below. Now I have to make a choice. Eels. She knew before he said it. Eels. Empire or you? Men tied to his business as their families. Workers on legal payrolls. Debts. Contracts. a whole ecosystem of power and dependence built over years, or the woman he had not meant to love and now could not imagine sending away. Feels. Isabella's chest tightened with a terrible tenderness. That isn't a choice, she whispered. It's extortion. I know. Then I'll leave. Roman's head snapped up. No. Roman, listen to me. If my absence gives you room to stabilize things, Feels. If we can make it look mutual, if that protects. No. The force in his voice shook the room. He crossed to her and held her face in both hands, the intensity in him nearly unbearable. Feels. Do not turn yourself into a sacrifice because men like my father only understand transactions. Do not do that to yourself for me. What if it saves you? It won't. He swallowed hard. It will only prove him right. Feels that everything human in me is negotiable. Feels. Isabella looked at him, at the fear, the rage, the helplessness he hated most. Then what do we do? Roman pulled her into him with the exhausted desperation of a man who had finally reached the edge of control and found love waiting there instead of safety. I don't know, he admitted, but this time I am not walking away first just because fear told me to. Feels. The days that followed were the kind that make ordinary routines feel like theater. Security doubled. Vincent spoke in low tones with men Isabella did not know. Elena kept the household running as if stability itself could be a political act. Feels. Roman slept less. He still went to meetings, still signed documents, still made the calls a man in his position could not avoid. But the pressure on him changed, not louder, heavier. Feels. He read reports at breakfast with one hand and held his coffee in the other, like it had become ceremonial rather than useful. Feels. Isabella watched the fatigue collect at the edges of him and thought about what power really costs when it is inherited in violence and maintained through compromise. One evening, she found him in his bathroom trying to wash blood from his knuckles. Feels. His shirt lay discarded on the floor. Fresh bruises bloomed over one side of his ribs. He looked up in the mirror as she entered and did not tell her to leave, which in itself felt intimate. Feels. It was one of mine, he said before she asked. A crew leader in Red Hook. Someone thought putting him in the hospital would make a point. Isabella turned on the tap, soaked a clean cloth in warm water, and stepped behind him. And did it? Feels. Roman's eyes met hers in the mirror. I think they understand my response. She cleaned his hands carefully. The cuts were shallow but raw. This is exactly what Elena warned me about, she murmured. Feels. That men like you don't know how to love without turning the room into a blast zone. Roman let out a breath that might have been a laugh in a less broken context. She's not wrong. I know. She touched one bruise lightly. He flinched. Sorry. Don't be. Feels. His voice had gone rough. It hurts less when you're the one touching it. The honesty in that nearly undid her. She set the cloth down and looked at him fully. Then, stop asking me to stand back and call it protection. Roman turned to face her. Feels. They were too close. Feels. Everything between them had become too honest for pretense. You think I don't want you beside me, he said. I think you want me beside you and hidden at the same time. Because those are the only two positions I know. Then learn a third. Feels. He stared at her, something almost desperate moving behind his eyes. You make that sound simple. No, I make it sound possible. He kissed her then, hard at first, all hunger and fear and stubborn need, one hand at the back of her neck, Feels. The other braced on the sink as though anchoring himself against the force of wanting, then softer, slower, as if he were relearning contact from the ground up. When he finally pulled back, he pressed his forehead to hers. I'm falling in love with you, Feels, he said, and I have never felt less qualified for something in my life. Isabella laughed softly even as her throat tightened. Good. Because I'm already there, and I'm not interested in pretending competence either. Feels. That night she slept in his bed for the first time in a way that felt like choosing rather than collapse. They did not make sex into proof. That mattered to Isabella, perhaps more than he understood. What they built that night was trust. He held her. Feels. They talked until exhaustion softened both of them into sleep. Roman told her things he had not told anyone in years. Not the operational details of his business, the human details, the way his father taught him to count respect and obedience. How? Feels. At 14, he learned that a delayed payment on a union job site could destroy a worker's family faster than a bullet, and decided then that systems frightened him more than overt violence, because they let people feel moral while doing harm. Feels. How he got involved in legitimate development, partly because he wanted power, and partly because he genuinely believed neighborhoods could be built instead of merely exploited. My father thinks that makes me sentimental, he said in the dark. Feels. But I've seen too many landlords turn desperation into policy. Housing is power. Schools are power. Debt is power. Crime is just one language for control. It's not the only one. Isabella listened, feels, struck by how close his analysis ran to the work she used to do and how wildly different their methods had been. You know, she said quietly, if we had met in another life, I might have argued with you at a planning board meeting for 3 hours. Feels. 3, I was being generous. He smiled into her hair. The next morning he left before sunrise again, but this time the note he left made her laugh out loud. Do not start a revolution without me. Back tonight, R. Heels. The laugh felt precious because joy had become such a contested thing in the penthouse. It did not last. By afternoon, Vincent arrived with a message from one of Roman's attorneys. 2 board members at a holding company had resigned unexpectedly. Feels. A bank relationship had gone quiet. Feels. One old capo in Jersey had begun delaying remittances. Small fractures, meaningful ones. Vincent Sr. was not charging with guns. He was using confidence as a contagion. Feels. Isabella spent that afternoon thinking not like a frightened wife, but like the housing organizer she used to be, the woman who knew systems and narratives, and the way power depends on what people think everyone else already believes. Fear spreads, feels. So does legitimacy. What if your father's argument isn't only that you've gone soft? She said over dinner when Roman finally got home. What if his argument is that you've become inconsistent? That people don't know what you'll protect anymore? Feels. Roman looked up from his untouched plate. Explain. You've been trying to run 2 moral logics at once. One you inherited. One you actually believe in. Your father can frame that as weakness. But maybe it's a transition problem. Feels. Not a leadership problem. Roman watched her very still. Go on. Feels. In community work, when people are used to scarcity, any change feels like a threat at first. Not because the old system was good, because uncertainty is expensive for the vulnerable. Feels. If your people think your emotional life now changes the rules without warning, your father wins by making fear feel familiar. You're saying I need to define the rules before he defines me. Yes. He leaned back slowly. Feels. Eyes narrowed not in skepticism but concentration. And you arrived at this by helping Brooklyn tenants fight predatory management companies. Funny how coercive hierarchies rhyme. Roman's mouth twitched. Feels. That may be the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. You still liked it. Yes. He stood and came around the table, then bent to kiss her forehead. Small gesture, intimate enough to feel enormous. Stay with that thought, he said. Feels. I need to make calls. Feels. Over the next 48 hours, Roman did exactly what Isabella suggested, though neither of them pretended the strategy was simple. He met with crew leaders, managers, attorneys, and heads of legitimate subsidiaries. Feels. He did not defend his marriage as a love story. That would have been foolish in that room. He reframed it as governance, stability, long-term insulation from blackmail through transparency within a defined personal boundary. More importantly, Feels, he made explicit what would and would not change under his leadership. Payroll would remain on time. No one's family would be used as leverage. Retaliatory violence required direct approval. Legal channels and community investments would expand. Feels, not contract. My father mistakes unpredictability for strength, he told them, according to Vincent, who returned from one meeting looking faintly impressed. Mr. Feels. DeLuca says institutions that depend entirely on fear collapse the moment someone stronger arrives. Feels. He says reliability is the point. Isabella sat at the kitchen table after Vincent reported this and felt a strange and aching pride, not because Roman was becoming gentle. He wasn't, because he was becoming coherent. There is dignity in that, Feels. There is healing in watching someone stop splitting themselves in half to survive the expectations of a man who never earned the title father in the emotional sense of the word. But old systems do not lose quietly. 2 nights later, Feels. A black SUV followed Isabella and Elena back from a private doctor's appointment. Elena insisted on arranging after weeks of stress left Isabella barely sleeping. Vincent noticed first. He changed routes twice. The SUV stayed on them for 6 blocks, Feels, then peeled off. Roman came home before they did, summoned by the call, and met them in the private garage, with fury written so plainly on his face that even the security team straightened. Were you touched? He demanded before the car fully stopped. Feels. No, Isabella said. Feels. Roman, no one touched me. He opened her door himself. His hand shook when it landed at her elbow. In the elevator, silence felt like a living animal. Once inside the penthouse, he started issuing orders, plate checks, camera pulls, faces on the route. Feels. Vincent already had a man making calls. Isabella waited until Roman hung up on his third person in under a minute. "Look at me," she said. He didn't. Roman, he turned. His fear was naked now, stripped of management. "I told you this would happen." Heels. Someone followed a car. "It's ugly. It's not a funeral." The words were blunt because panic needed interruption. Roman closed the distance between them and gripped both her shoulders carefully as if confirming solidity. Heels. "I cannot lose you to a lesson my father is trying to teach." The sentence hit her harder than if he had said, "I love you." Because this was not romance, it was terror telling the truth. Isabella covered his hands with hers. Heels. "Then stop fighting this like it's only about proving him wrong," she said softly. "Fight it because you know what kind of life you want to build, not just what kind of man you refuse to remain." He looked at her for a long, stunned beat. "You do this to me, Heels," he murmured. "Do what? Turn strategy into conscience." She almost smiled. "Maybe you just had one all along." That night, after security sweeps and another round of calls, Heels. Roman sat on the floor of the library with his back against the sofa and Isabella tucked beside him, both too wired to sleep. "When my mother died," he said into the dark, "my father told me grief was indulgence." Heels. He said men either master pain or become ruled by it. I spent years believing the only alternative to collapse was control. Isabella rested her head on his shoulder. "And now I think ungrieved pain simply changes uniforms." She closed her eyes. Heels. "That might be the smartest thing any mafia boss has ever said." He huffed a laugh. Heels. "Do not tell anyone. I have a reputation. Your secret is safe with me." "No," Roman said quietly. "It isn't. That's the problem." But this time when he said it, it sounded less like accusation and more like awe. The next morning brought another shift. Heels. Smaller and more dangerous, precisely because it was smaller. One of Roman's oldest advisors, a man named Adriano who had known Vincent Sr. for decades, requested a private meeting and then failed to show. By noon, Heels. He had aligned himself publicly with the father. "He won't move first with violence," Roman said to Isabella after the call. "He wants me cornered into making a mistake. If I overreact, I confirm every story he's telling. Then don't overreact." Heels. "That advice is offensively reasonable. I contain multitudes, remember?" He looked tired enough to smile without defending against it. Then he sobered. "There may be another way." "Which is?" Roman hesitated. "There are records from the old days." Heels. "My father's original shipping books, payments, judges, union officers, cash flows from the years before we pushed everything into cleaner channels, kept copies, insurance." "Vanity, I don't know." Isabella sat up straighter. "And if those records surfaced," Heels, "they would not send him to prison. Men like him are harder to bury than that. But they would fracture his support. Some families rely on nostalgia because they can edit the past. Documents are less sentimental. So get them." Roman's expression went dark. Heels. "They're in his house." "Of course they are. In a private archive behind his study. He trusts paper more than people." Isabella considered the absurdity of it. Then an even more absurd thought arrived. Roman saw it form and shook his head immediately. "No." Heels. "You don't even know what I was going to say." "Yes, I do. And no, you're right," she said. "It was reckless. I was going to suggest I could distract him while absolutely not." "I said you were right." Heels. "You also sound interested in the recklessness, only academically." He looked unconvinced. "Your problem," Roman said, "is that you grew up surviving chaos and therefore mistake impossible for negotiable." Heels. "Your problem is that you keep saying my problem like you aren't clearly in love with it." Roman went silent in the way he did when hit by truth he couldn't afford to enjoy. Then, Heels, because they were both exhausted and the world outside the penthouse was sharpening into decision, he leaned down and kissed the top of her head. "Stay academic," he said. "That is an order. You know orders are less effective now." "I know." Heels. "It is deeply inconvenient." 2 nights later, Vincent Sr. made the next move for them. He sent an invitation that was not an invitation. Family lunch, upstate estate, Sunday. Attendance expected. Roman read the note once and went very still. Heels. Isabella took it from his hand. "He wants us on his ground, yes. Then he thinks he has already won." Heels. Roman's jaw flexed. "Or he thinks proximity will remind my people where the original center of gravity lives." Same difference. He looked at her. "You don't have to come. I know. I mean it." Isabella folded the note carefully. Heels. "And let him say I hid because I was scared? No. I'm done donating free narrative to cruel men." Roman stared at her with a mixture of admiration and imminent headache. "One day," he said, "I'm going to experience a quiet emotion because of you." "No." Heels. "You won't." He almost smiled. "No, probably not." On Sunday, the DeLuca estate upstate was less mansion than thesis statement. Stone gates, old trees, gravel arranged to sound expensive under tires. Yields. The house itself carried the weight of a time when men proved legitimacy by building structures intended to outlive accountability. Vincent Sr. received them in a sunroom lined with antiques and family photographs that looked curated rather than loved. Yields. Isabella saw Roman at 12 in one silver frame, already too composed. No mother anywhere. That told its story. Lunch was served on a terrace overlooking formal gardens because nothing says dynastic menace like clipped hedges. Yields. Vincent Sr. was gracious in the most dangerous way possible, warm enough to seem civilized, sharp enough that every kindness felt like a scalpel. He spoke to Isabella about art, philanthropy, and education, Yields, all while measuring whether she understood her symbolic function in the conflict. I hear you used to work in housing, he said over coffee. How earnest. People need homes, Isabella replied. They also need leverage, he said. Yields. Most people confuse the two. Roman set his cup down. If you brought us here to lecture, write a book. His father smiled. I brought you here to offer peace. Isabella felt Roman go cold beside her. You don't offer peace, he said. You offer terms. Yields. Very good. Vincent Sr. folded his hands. Simple ones. Yields. Annul the marriage quietly. Public statement about incompatibility. You focus on operations. She receives a settlement large enough to start over somewhere far from your enemies. Isabella looked at Roman, then back at the older man. And if he says no, Yields. Vincent Sr.'s eyes rested on her with almost paternal pity. Then everyone will learn how expensive sentiment becomes when mixed with leadership. Isabella understood then. This was not only about Roman, it was about punishment. Yields. A father furious that the son he trained had developed a conscience powerful enough to choose love in public. You keep calling it sentiment, she said softly. That's one way to avoid admitting it might be integrity. Vincent Sr. laughed. Yields. There is Caroline again. Roman stood so abruptly his chair scraped stone. Do not use dead women to discipline the living. His father rose more slowly. Sit down. No, you always think refusal is strength. Yields. And you always think fear is proof of intelligence. Yields. They stood facing each other across the terrace table, while wind moved lightly through the trees, absurdly gentle given the violence underneath the scene. Isabella rose too, not because she intended to intervene physically, Yields, because women are too often expected to remain seated while men decide which version of brutality counts as legacy. Enough, she said. Both men turned. Good, let them. You want to know what I see, she continued, voice steady. Yields. I see one man who built an empire because he thought controlling everyone around him was the same as protecting them. And I see another man trying badly sometimes, Yields, to build something more stable without knowing how to free himself from the first education. Vincent Sr.'s mouth hardened. You are out of your depth. No, Isabella said. I'm exactly where women have always been, Yields. In the room after men make their damage into tradition, Yields. Roman's face changed as she spoke, not with fear this time, but with something fierce and proud and terrified all at once. His father's expression turned to polished stone. You have no idea, Vincent Sr. said quietly, what these choices cost. Yields. I know exactly what coercion costs, Isabella replied. I lived it before I ever met your son. It just wore cheaper clothes then. Silence stretched. Then Vincent Sr. smiled in a way that made even the air feel colder. You're right about one thing, Yields, he said. He did not choose a weak wife. His gaze moved to Roman. Pity. Strong women break louder. Roman stepped between them then, not dramatically, simply with finality. We're leaving. His father did not stop them. That was the worst part, Yields. Men like him only let people walk away when they believe the next move will land cleaner elsewhere. In the car back to the city, Roman said almost nothing. His hand found Isabella's and held it the entire drive, grip hard enough to ache. Yields. She let it. Sometimes pain is simply information. Sometimes it is a language for I am still here. Back at the penthouse, he locked the study door behind them and went straight to the cabinet where he kept the good whiskey. Yields. He poured 2 fingers and then abandoned the glass untouched on the desk. He's going to escalate, he said. I know. He'll assume public confrontation means private fracture. He'll look for pressure points. Banks, contracts, Yields. Maybe prosecutors he still owns in peripheral ways. Maybe physical intimidation again. Isabella moved closer. Then we stop reacting and start ending it. Roman gave her a tired, dangerous look. That sounds simple. It isn't, but it is clear, Yields. She glanced toward the shelf where Caroline's letters lay hidden and then back to him. If the old records can break his story, we get the records. Roman opened his mouth to object. Isabella raised a hand. No, hear me. Not because I want to play spy, Eels, because this isn't just about us anymore, Eels. It's about whether his model wins again, whether every person under your leadership learns that tenderness is always punishable. I refuse that lesson. Roman looked at her for a very long time. Then, slowly, Eels, he sat on the edge of the desk and rubbed both hands over his face. When he dropped them, the rawness there made him look younger and older at once. You make it very difficult to hide from the right thing, he said. Good, she answered. Eels. That seems healthy. He laughed despite himself, then reached for her, pulling her into the space between his knees. His forehead rested against her sternum. It was the most vulnerable posture she had ever seen from him. Not because he looked small, Eels. He didn't, because he allowed himself to lean. We do it carefully. No improvisation, no heroics, no turning yourself into proof of loyalty. Isabella threaded her fingers through his hair. Deal, Eels. He tilted his head back to look at her. Eels. I don't trust the look in your eye. That's because you're smart. That is not reassuring. It's all I have. He pulled her down and kissed her, a kiss full of exhaustion and faith and the strange, Eels, stubborn joy of finding one person willing to stand in the truth with you when truth is expensive. For the first time since the contract, Isabella understood something that changed the meaning of the whole story. She had not merely been bought, Eels. She had been thrown into a system that treated people like leverage, yes, but within that system she had also become a witness, and witnesses can alter outcomes. Not by magic, by insisting on reality, by refusing euphemism, Eels, by reminding damaged men that care is not the same as weakness, and that respect for another human being is not an ornament to power. It is the only thing that keeps power from becoming rot, Eels. The plan, when it finally took shape, looked less cinematic than Isabella would have expected from the life she had accidentally entered. That was reassuring, Eels. Real life rarely hinges on dramatic monologues and midnight theft with violin music behind it. Real life is calendars, gate logs, predictable egos, blind spots disguised as traditions, Eels. Vincent Sr. hosted a memorial luncheon every year for a judge who had once done his family a series of favors, and later died on a golf course of what the newspapers called natural causes. The event was old school, men in dark suits, Eels, priests who knew better than to know too much, widow speeches. A ritual of influence disguised as remembrance. More importantly, it pulled half the senior staff out of the main house and kept Vincent Sr. in public-facing rooms for several hours, Eels, basking in the respect he mistook for love. Roman knew the estate's layout from childhood. He knew where the private archive was, Eels. He also knew his father trusted systems built before the digital age. Paper backups, mechanical locks, a hidden room behind the study accessed through a false wall, lined with first edition histories no one in the family had ever read, Eels. He thinks the tactile nature of paper makes it loyal, Roman said the night before. That sentence sounds like your father wrote poetry for sociopaths, Isabella murmured. Roman's mouth twitched. That's unfair to poetry, Eels. The original plan involved Roman going in alone through a service entrance while loyal security outside created enough harmless distraction to keep the inner staff occupied, Eels. Isabella was to remain in the city with Vincent and 3 separate numbers to call if anything went wrong. She agreed. Then she looked at the floor plan again and pointed to one problem. Your father's housekeeper. Roman glanced over. Marta, Eels. She notices everything. Yes, and she hates last-minute floral changes because it disrupts table symmetry. Eels. Roman stared. How do you know that? Because at your wedding reception, she told a cater waiter, and I quote, arrangement is morality, and chaos is for men who don't have to clean. I remember competent women, Eels. Roman rubbed a hand over his mouth to hide either a smile or concern. Isabella. I'm not changing the plan. I'm telling you someone needs to keep Marta occupied near the front terrace when the lunch starts. She is your real security system, Eels. He exhaled slowly. Fine, Elena will handle her. Better. She hesitated. And Margaret Hastings will be there. Roman's expression hardened. Probably. She loves gossip more than oxygen. If she sees me absent on a day she expects me to appear, Eels, she might ask questions later. So I should attend the luncheon after all. Roman stood up from the table with the kind of calm that preceded arguments. No, Roman, no. Listen. If I'm present, your father's attention stays split. Eels. If I'm absent, he has one less variable to monitor and more space to notice the house rhythm. Roman came around the kitchen island and braced both palms on the counter, caging her without touching. Heels. I am not taking you into my father's house on purpose while I am trying to expose him. You are, if it increases our odds. You are not an odds adjustment, and you are not the only one allowed to be brave. The words sat between them, hot and immediate. Heels. Roman closed his eyes once, briefly. When he opened them, the fear was there naked again, mixed with admiration and fury. This is what I mean, he said quietly. You keep making me choose between loving you well and respecting your agency. Heels. And I am bad at the version where those don't feel mutually threatening. Isabella's anger dissolved. She reached for his face. Then choose the second, she said softly. Respect me. I know the risk. I'm still here. Heels. He leaned into her hand for one helpless second, then turned and paced away. Heels. You will stay in the public rooms, he said finally. You will not leave them unless Elena is with you.
If I send Vincent?
You listen to Vincent. If something feels wrong, you leave immediately without arguing. Isabella waited. Heels. That sounds like conditional approval. Roman pointed at her without turning back. Do not enjoy this. Too late, I mean it. I know. On the drive upstate the next day, rain traced thin gray lines down the windows. The weather made everyone quieter. Heels. Roman wore a black suit and the expression he used when preparing for surgery on a rotten institution. Isabella wore dark cream, understated but not timid. Elena sat across from them in the back of the long car like a commander disguised as elegance. Heels. If anyone separates you from the line of sight to the main stairs, you refuse, Elena said. If Margaret starts fishing, I reel her in? Isabella asked. No, Elena said dryly. You let her monologue. It is the most effective form of sedation. Heels. Roman took Isabella's hand where Elena pretended not to see. This is the last time I agree to a plan that requires your calm in a room full of women who think cruelty is refinement, he murmured. I survived nonprofit donor boards, she said. Heels. I've trained for this. The memorial luncheon was exactly as distasteful as advertised. Vincent Sr. stood beneath the portrait of the late judge and accepted condolences that sounded suspiciously like pledges. Politicians arrived. Priests. Heels. Men whose grandchildren likely thought they made money in distribution. Margaret Hastings, naturally, drifted over within minutes, dressed in black silk and opportunism. My dear, she said to Isabella, you look pale. Marriage suiting you? Heels. Isabella smiled with all the warmth of a closed elevator door. Excellently. Grief events always bring out the best in people. Margaret laughed, too pleased by cynicism to hear the insult. Roman looks tense, she said. Heels, eyes sliding toward him across the room. Heels. Family gatherings do that. Oh, families. Such efficient little machines for damage. Margaret lifted her glass. Still, one must admire Vincent Sr. He understands legacy. Does he? Isabella said. I thought he understood ownership. Heels. Margaret studied her over the rim of her drink, fox-bright. You really do have opinions. How novel. Only in rooms where women are expected not to. Before Margaret could respond, Heels. Elena arrived at Isabella's side and asked an elaborate question about seating, drawing her away toward Marta, and a crisis involving peonies and symmetry. Across the room, Roman caught Isabella's eye once, the slightest nod. Heels. Then he vanished down a side corridor at the exact moment a bishop began speaking too long about public service. Isabella turned her attention fully to the performance in front of her. Margaret murmured to a banker. Heels. Vincent Sr. held court near the portrait. Two old capos argued gently about a shipping contract in Newark. Heels. Everything looked normal. That was the point. Hidden violence often prefers decorum as camouflage. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Isabella drank half a glass of sparkling water and smiled through 3 conversations she would later barely remember. Heels. At minute 22, the first ripple moved through the room. Not panic, not yet. The house security chief entered from the front hall and bent to murmur in Vincent Sr.'s ear. The older man's face did not change, but his spine did. Heels. Attention sharpened. Isabella's heart kicked. Roman, she thought, or discovery. Elena appeared again from nowhere, one hand lightly at Isabella's elbow. Bathroom, she said in a tone that meant exactly the opposite. Heels. They moved toward the powder room corridor, just as Margaret called after them. Don't disappear, dear. The speeches improve when half the room drinks enough. Inside the powder room, Elena closed the door and waited 1 beat. Heels. Vincent stepped out from the connecting service hall where he absolutely should not have been if nothing were happening. Mr. DeLuca has the records, he said quietly. We're leaving now. Isabella's pulse pounded in her ears. Was he seen? Heels. Vincent's expression did not shift. Probably. That is not reassuring. No, Mom. They moved fast through a staff corridor toward the back drive. Halfway there, a door slammed somewhere behind them. Men's voices, sharp heels. Isabella did not need the words to understand tone. Discovery had become pursuit. Vincent pressed a small radio to his mouth and spoke two clipped instructions. Heels. Elena took Isabella's hand not gently but effectively, and they ran the last 30 feet to the garage access. Rain hit cold and immediate as they crossed open ground. The SUV doors opened. Vincent got Elena in first, then Isabella. Roman? Heels, Isabella demanded. Vincent was already sliding behind the wheel. Coming. That is not an answer. The engine turned over. Heels. Tires spit gravel. Then Roman appeared from the far side of the house, running hard through rain, jacket gone, tie gone. One hand pressed briefly to his side. Heels. He yanked open the passenger door and got in just as another black sedan came around the drive too fast. Vincent hit the accelerator. The world blurred into rain, trees, and the vicious geometry of fear. Were you hit? Heels. Isabella asked before the gate was even behind them. Roman was breathing hard but controlled. No, Roman. No. He looked at her then, and she saw blood along his shirt where a shelf corner or an elbow or a bad twist had opened something. Not gunfire. Heels. Not yet. Behind them, headlights gained and then fell back as Vincent took a turn at unreasonable speed. Elena braced one hand on the headrest and said, with the calm of a woman who had clearly chosen this life consciously at some point, Heels. Marta threw a serving tray at one of the men trying to lock down the hall. Isabella blinked. I knew she valued symmetry. Heels. Roman let out one stunned breath of laughter, then winced as his side protested. They did not go to the city, of course not. Too obvious. Vincent drove toward a legal property in Westchester, Heels, one of Roman's secure houses used when negotiations required privacy or news required distance. There, in a quiet brick house, overlooking wet trees and a river gone gray in the storm, Heels. The records were spread across a dining table less glamorous than the one where Isabella signed her contract but infinitely more hopeful. Old ledgers, payment books, insurance policies, political cash allocations, notes in Vincent Sr.'s hand, Heels. Names of judges, union officials, contractors, enough to fracture myth, if not the law. Roman stood at the table with wet hair and rolled shirt sleeves, blood clean from his side, and looked more alive than Isabella had seen him in weeks. This is it, Heels, he said. This is the spine. Then we break it, Isabella said. Not with police. Roman was too realistic for that. Heels. Men like his father left trails built to be survivable, but with exposure aimed where loyalty was shallowest and reputation mattered most. A controlled leak to a federal inquiry already circling one of the old unions. Heels. Select documents to a newspaper financial desk through Shell Counsel. Quiet deliveries to two families Vincent Sr. had been privately double-crossing in his nostalgia campaign. Mutually assured disillusionment. Heels. Isabella murmured after 2 hours of strategy, surrounded by paper evidence that old men still confused secrecy with immortality. Roman looked at her with tired admiration. That is a terrible phrase. Nice. That's why I'm not in branding. Heels. He came around the table and cupped the back of her neck. The room had gone quieter. Vincent was on the phone in the next room. Elena had finally convinced a doctor to look at Roman's side. Rain softened outside. You were right, Roman said. Heels. About what? Isabella blinked. That's all for now. Heels. He kissed her forehead, then her mouth. Brief. Grateful. You were right that if I kept reacting only to him, I would never build anything different. Her eyes burned suddenly. Not because victory was certain. It wasn't. Heels. Because growth rarely arrives as a clean triumph. Sometimes it arrives as a man raised by cruelty finally choosing values before tactics, even in the middle of tactical necessity. Heels. That night they slept in separate rooms because the house was crowded with security and work still pulsed through every floor. At 3 a.m, Isabella woke to a soft knock. Roman stood outside her door in a t-shirt and fatigue. Heels. No armor left except what bone and regret had built long before she met him. I know this is a foolish question given everything, he said, but can I come in? She almost cried at the asking. The respect in it mattered. Heels. All the more because he had once purchased the illusion of a right to her life and was now asking permission just to sit beside her in the dark. Yes, she said. He crossed the room and lay down beside her fully clothed, Heels, gathering her carefully as if he still couldn't believe she was real or willing. For a long time they said nothing. Then Roman spoke into the quiet. When you signed that contract, I told myself I was containing damage. Heels. Today I realized I was continuing it. Isabella turned to face him. And now, Now, I think the only version of love worth having is one that treats the other person as fully human, even when fear is screaming for possession. She touched his face lightly. Heals. That sounds like healing. It sounds like work. Same thing, smiled in the dark. You make even that sound possible. By morning, the machinery had begun. Calls, leaks, quiet meetings. Heals. The article landed 48 hours later in a financial paper not known for sentiment. Heals. Historic corruption. Off-book payments, union manipulation, legacy ties resurfacing, enough to spook banks, embarrass politicians, and force public distance from the old guard. One federal office declined to comment, Eels, which told Roman more than comment would have. Two of Vincent Sr.'s nostalgic allies suddenly developed appointments elsewhere. Adriano called requesting a private discussion about continuity. Roman declined the phrase and granted the meeting, Eels. Piece by piece, the myth of the father as guardian of the true order began to degrade under the much duller, much more effective acid of proof. Vincent Sr. called once. Roman did not put him on speaker. Eels. He took the call alone in the study of the safe house, listened for nearly 2 minutes, then said, "No, this is you discovering that history can become testimony." He hung up. Eels. When he came back into the kitchen, Isabella looked up from the tea she had stopped pretending could fix everything and simply asked, "Was he angry?" Roman sat opposite her. He was offended. Worse? For men like him, yes. He reached across the table, Eels, and she gave him her hand. Outside, the rain had cleared. The river beyond the trees was the color of worn silver. The future remained uncertain in all the practical ways that matter. There would be retaliation, reorganization, Eels, a long season of consequences. But something fundamental had shifted. Vincent Sr. had not only lost leverage, he had lost the right to define strength for his son. That kind of loss does not make headlines. It does, however, alter generations. Eels. 3 weeks later, they were back in Manhattan. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. Because life, when it survives a storm, eventually asks whether you intend to keep hiding in the weather or start rebuilding in it. Eels. The penthouse felt different when they returned. Same marble, same windows, same views of a city too busy surviving itself to care much about any single family's private civil war. Yet the place no longer felt like a museum of controlled emptiness. Eels. Not because Roman had softened the architecture, because truth had been spoken inside it too many times for the old silence to remain unchallenged. Some of Vincent Sr.'s allies withdrew. Some stayed hostile. Eels. A few came around not out of moral awakening, but because money dislikes instability. Roman accepted that. Ethics and incentives rarely arrive in the same car. He told Isabella one evening as they stood in the kitchen waiting for water to boil. Eels. But if they move in the same direction, I'm not too proud to use the ride. She smiled. That may be the most urban planning adjacent thing you've ever said. He leaned a hip against the counter. You've infected my language. Eels. It was medically necessary. Publicly, the narrative shifted with careful restraint. No dramatic interviews, no operatic declarations. Roman held a quiet meeting with senior partners and reiterated the governance line he had already begun to set. Eels. Family remains private. Retaliation requires oversight. No one's spouse, child, or parent is to be used as leverage. Payroll and medical obligations remain non-negotiable. Community investments tied to legal developments will expand. Eels. Including affordable housing percentages that had previously been flexible on paper and fictional in practice. That last one came from Isabella, and Roman did not present it as charity. Eels. Stability is profit over time. He told a room full of men who preferred morality translated into spreadsheets. Rotating people through displacement is expensive. Neighborhood hostility is expensive. Litigation is expensive. Eels. We build durable structures or we keep paying for our own short-term thinking. Some men resisted. Of course they did. Others, especially the younger ones who had children and mortgages instead of legend as their primary identity, listened. Eels. Change in entrenched systems is rarely cinematic. It is repetitive, annoying, full of compromised drafts and arguments over line items. That did not make it less real. If anything, it made it more honorable. Isabella returned, cautiously, Eels, to work that felt like herself. Not her old nonprofit exactly, too visible, too easy to use against her if anyone wanted to simplify her into a contradiction. Eels. Instead, she began consulting quietly with a coalition on tenant protection and mixed income development, partly through channels Roman's legitimate companies already touched. Are you sure this doesn't create a conflict? Eels. She asked him one night while reviewing housing proposals at the dining table. Roman, on the other side of that table with contracts of his own, looked up. Everything creates a conflict, feels. The question is whether the conflict serves people or just protects ego. She set down her pen and studied him. Sometimes you say things that would make an excellent social policy podcast. Don't insult me. It was almost a compliment. Even worse, feels. They had by then learned a shape for intimacy that neither of them had inherited from healthy models. That meant learning in public and private both. Roman asked now, in small ways and large ones, "May I? Are you tired? Do you want company or space?" Feels. Consent did not appear magically because desire existed. Feels. It became part of the architecture of their life because Isabella insisted, and because Roman was finally brave enough to discover that asking does not diminish love. It dignifies it. For a man raised to equate care with control, feels, this was no small transformation. Some nights he still woke from dreams with grief sitting heavy on his chest. Some Caroline returned to him not as guilt but as sadness, and that was harder in a quieter way, feels. One such night, he sat on the floor by the bedroom window at 3 a.m, knees drawn up slightly, city lights reflecting off the glass. Isabella woke and joined him without speaking. After a while he said, "Feels. I'm afraid that healing from her means betraying her." Isabella considered that. "Do you think she loved you so little that she wanted your life to stop?" Roman's laugh was faint. "No. Then maybe carrying grief and moving forward are not opposites." Feels. Maybe that's what respect actually looks like. Not turning a person into a shrine. Feels. Letting what they changed in you keep living. He was quiet a long time. You always make room for the dead without letting them run the house. Someone has to manage your emotional zoning laws. He leaned his head against her shoulder. "I love you, Feels," he said. He had said it before by then, but never casually, never as punctuation, always as an act of full attention. Isabella put her hand over his. "I love you too." That was not the fairy tale reward. The reward was what came next, Feels. They stayed there in the dark, unspectacular and honest, allowing grief and love to share a room without turning either into a weapon. Months passed. Vincent Sr. did not disappear, because men like that never vanish neatly. He retreated, consolidated, Feels. Tried once or twice to test old lines, but the mythology had fractured. Too many documents, too many practical interests now tied to Roman's steadier model. Too many people who preferred predictability to theater. Feels. In one final meeting, held not at the penthouse or the estate, but in a neutral law office downtown, father and son sat across from each other while attorneys discussed trusts, voting rights, Feels, and the transfer of residual authority over several family vehicles. Isabella waited in the reception lounge with a book she did not actually read. When Roman emerged an hour later, his face gave little away. They rode the elevator down in silence. Feels. On the sidewalk, amid the ordinary miracle of taxis and office workers and rain threatening again, she finally asked, "What happened?" Roman looked out at the avenue, then at her. He said, "I've made myself vulnerable in ways he never would have allowed," Feels. "And you?" I told him that was the first decision I've made that actually felt like strength. Isabella smiled slowly. How did he like that? Roman opened the car door for her, as much as one might expect. In time, Feels, the wedding contract itself became an object of strange significance. Feels. It sat in Roman's safe long after lawyers could have rendered it irrelevant. One evening, nearly a year after Isabella signed it, she found him holding the old file open on his desk. "Why do you still have this?" she asked from the doorway. Feels. Roman looked down at the pages and then up at her. "Because I need to remember what I was willing to call practical." He closed the folder. "And because I'd like your permission to destroy it." The request hit her deep. This mattered to him, Feels. Not theatrically, morally. "Yes," she said. He brought the papers to the fireplace in the library. They burned faster than she expected. Contracts often do once the belief sustaining them is gone. Isabella watched the edges curl, the clauses blacken, Feels, the signatures vanish into heat. "You know," she said softly, "for a long time I thought the lesson of all this was that love changes people." Roman stood beside her, hands in his pockets, face warm in the firelight. Feels. "And now I think the real lesson is that respect changes the shape of love. Without that, it's just fear with prettier language." Roman looked at her with a kind of seriousness that had once frightened her and now felt like home. Feels. "I wish I had known that earlier." Isabella slipped her hand into his, maybe, but knowing it now still matters to every person who comes after you. He was quiet. "Then that sounds like too much responsibility." You run half of Manhattan, feels. You can manage an ethical framework. Debitable. She laughed and leaned against him. Outside, the city kept moving. Somewhere rent was due. Somewhere someone was signing a contract they wished they could refuse. Somewhere, feels. A father was teaching his son the wrong definition of strength. The world had not become kind just because one man chose better. But kindness was never the right measure. What mattered was interruption. One lie interrupted, one system bent. Feels. One person treated as fully human where power expected compliance. That was how change happened in real life. Not all at once. Not with purity, with repetition, with courage practiced in unglamorous places. Feels. With people who say no when no is expensive and yes when yes is healing. Isabella went back to school part-time the following spring for urban policy and development. Feels. Roman pretended he had no opinion until she caught him comparing graduate programs and arranging security considerations around campus routes she had not yet accepted. You know that's controlling, she told him over breakfast, waving the printout. Feels. It's logistical affection, he said without looking up from the paper. That isn't a legal term. It should be. She threw a napkin at him. He caught it one-handed and smiled, the expression now familiar enough to feel like earned light. Feels. Marcus started community college and eventually joined a trades apprenticeship through a union that, in a twist neither sibling would have considered possible 2 years earlier, Feels, had been cleaned up after several public investigations into the old networks. Her mother moved to a better apartment with decent windows and a landlord who answered repair calls within the same week. Feels. Elena took one full weekend off every month under explicit household policy and acted as if this reform were personally embarrassing. Feels. Vincent continued to run security with a degree of dry devotion that suggested love sometimes looks like relentless competence and very little small talk. Margaret Hastings remained unbearable. Feels. But even she adjusted her tone once she realized Isabella was not a passing vulnerability, but a fixture with memory and precision. At one fundraiser, Margaret said, I must admit, my dear, you've been unexpectedly durable. Feels. Isabella smiled sweetly. Thank you. Feels. So have labor protections, despite resistance. Roman nearly choked on his drink. Later in the car, he laughed hard enough that she kissed the corner of his mouth to steady him. Not because everything was perfect. Because joy, when honestly earned, Feels, deserves witnesses too. And that was the thing no one tells you enough. Healing is not a grand redemption speech. It is choosing over and over not to let old injuries dictate every new relationship. Feels. It is admitting when protection has become possession. It is asking instead of assuming. It is grieving the dead without burying the living alongside them. It is building structures in business and in love that do not depend on fear to function. Feels. Roman never became harmless. That would have been a fantasy, and fantasies help no one if you are trying to tell the truth. He remained dangerous in the ways the world had made necessary, and in some ways he still chose. Feels. Isabella never became naive enough to forget the compromises under their life. Feels. That would have been another lie, but they built something within those realities that carried actual value. Respect, consent, accountability, protection that did not erase autonomy. Ambition tied, however imperfectly, Feels, to public good rather than pure extraction. And perhaps that is the most realistic ending of all. Not that love conquers every system, it doesn't, but that love, when disciplined by respect, Feels, can keep people from becoming the worst lessons they were taught. Years later, when people told the story badly, they would focus on the glamour first, the penthouse, the suit, the contract, the old money war. They would miss the quieter core. Feels. A woman refusing to become an object, even when every circumstance invited her to disappear into one. A man confronting the way grief and power had warped his idea of care. A house manager who understood that order can be a form of dignity. Feels. A driver who did not waste words because loyalty can be fluent without being loud. Feels. A city where housing, debt, legitimacy, crime, and class were all tangled together in the same human fabric. Those details matter. They are the difference between fantasy and a story that might actually help someone listening. Because somewhere, Feels, someone might hear this and recognize the contract in their own life, even if it does not involve marble floors or organized crime. It might be a family expectation, a workplace, a marriage held together by fear called duty. Feels. A grief turned into identity. And maybe they will hear, beneath all the drama, the simplest truth in the whole story. You cannot build anything worth living in if you do not first learn to respect the people inside it. Roman learned that deals. Isabella demanded it, and the life they made after that was not clean, not easy, not innocent. It was better, in the only way that counts. It made more room for other human beings to remain human too.